Hello YouTube! Today we're going to be talking about Miyazaki's latest movie, The Boy and the Heron, which is not something I typically cover on this channel, but ever since I saw this movie, I've been obsessed with it, and I have many thoughts. I actually have written 7 pages, a 7-page essay about the movie. And since I started this YouTube page to be able to express myself, I think it would be a waste to not share it with you guys. So, if you are a Ghibli fan, I think you are going to greatly enjoy this. If you're not, I don't know why you clicked on this video, but understand that this is going to make no sense to you whatsoever. And if you haven't watched The Boy and the Heron as well, this video is going to be full of spoilers, okay? I'm going to spoil the entire movie. So if you haven't seen it, please do not watch this. But if you have, you most likely loved it, because Ghibli fans in general seem to believe that this movie is one of Miyazaki's masterpieces. Some people even say it's his best movie. And I personally disagree with that entirely. I personally think it's one of his worst movies. The entire video is going to be segmented into 4 parts. The characters first, then we'll talk about the plot, then we'll discuss the themes of the movie, and to end we'll talk about the philosophy of Miyazaki. All of which are going to contribute to the same argument, which is the idea that all of these traits I just described that make the movie fail at doing what they're supposed to do because they're not developed enough. And when you look at what makes Ghibli movies and Miyazaki movies great in particular is the fact that they tend to have the ability to create a self-contained world, a self-contained universe within the time frame and the runtime of one movie. So from start to finish, you're presented a universe that is completely opposed to your own, with a completely different set of rules, but by the end of the movie, it makes sense. It all makes sense, and you're left with a message. To me, The Boy and the Heron does not do that. By the end of the movie, you are left with so many questions unresolved, and you're also not quite certain what the message of the movie was. So, my goal today is going to be to explain to you exactly why the movie fails and what it should have done differently in order to provide the Ghibli movie experience that I was hoping to receive and that I did not get. Starting, as I said, with the characters. So to begin, I think it's great to look at Mahito because he's the hero of the story. So with Mahito, the first thing we learn is that he lost his mom. So that's the central part of his character. He's a young boy who is dealing with grief. Everything else we learn through his actions. The movie is not giving us much. He doesn't have many lines of dialogue or exposition, which is perfectly fine. A tenet of a good movie is show, don't tell. If you have to explain to me this character is brave, you failed at your job. You should show me that he's brave. And so that is okay. I'm not criticizing that. Miyazaki does that beautifully well. Every character tends to be developed that way. So if we look at Mahito, for example, his demeanor is one of a young boy who acts like a soldier. And you see that from the first minutes of the movie, where he walks very rigid, he bows to salute people, he's extremely stoic. Not the demeanor that you would expect from someone his age. But that, retrospectively, is explained by the trauma. It's because he's holding in the trauma of losing his mother, and so he has become quite reserved. Also because he cannot rely on the adults in his life to actually help, because as we come to understand, his dad is emotionally incompetent. So his dad doesn't seem to understand the turmoil that his son is going through. And that's something I'll explain later. That is also a Miyazaki trope. A good trope when utilized properly, but in this movie, it's simply not. So we now have a boy who is on his own, who has no one to rely on, and he has to deal with the grief and the trauma. Excellent. That's the start of a good story. It could have been the start of a very good plot line within the movie. As a result of this trauma, we see that Mahito is tortured by the pain, and the pain creates nightmares. Every single night, more or less, he relives the death of his mom. He has to again relive the failure of saving his mom, and that is something he never expresses. You never hear it express it to other characters in the story. He keeps it to himself because he's not able to mourn properly. because he's a young boy. He cannot let go of his mom. But by refusing to let go of his mom, he is times and times tortured by the thought of her because he has not yet accepted that she is gone. And so, of course, he feels extremely alone. The movie shows you he's alone. Even when he's surrounded by people, it seems that he cannot reconnect with them, which is interesting because as an audience member, it's very tough to connect with him as well. Because the movie gives you nothing, just like he gives nothing to the people of the movie to connect with. Then there's also the fact that he seems to have an abandonment issue, and that is linked to the fact that his dad remarried and now has a kid to be born with another woman. So Mahito is apprehensive because he thinks, okay, am I going to be left to the side? Am I going to be abandoned? His dad, again, is the last person in his life that he's connected to. It's his guardian. But if he is to go without him, then he will be truly alone. And so he starts to develop resentment towards his new stepmom and even towards the to-be-born kid, the child that is to be his brother. All of this is a lot of emotional baggage to carry for a very young boy. But all of that I just described to you is never taught. This is something that you have to actually decipher by yourself by paying attention to the story. If you rely on dialogues to understand what Mahito is, what he stands for, what his main theme is, you will understand absolutely nothing, and that is fine. Again, Miyazaki always does this. Miyazaki believes that if you don't understand symbolism or you don't understand psychology, then you are not worthy of his movies. And it is something that I love about him and that I also accept. The problem is that all of what I just described happens within 10 minutes. All of these key elements to be able to understand the movie happen so fast that unless you pay attention or you do what I did, which is to write down your thoughts after the movie, you will miss some of it. And how could you not miss it? It's a movie. Most people are not actually paying that close of an attention at the start of a very long story. The movie is 2 hours long. If you compare that with Nausicaa, for example, which is also a great movie, you realize that this is the difference. Both of these movies tell a story through what is known as environmental storytelling. So you're told the story by the environment around the characters. But the difference is that in Nausicaa herself has plenty of time to develop. So even though you have no dialogues to tell you, well, she's a brave princess and she fights for her people and she cares about nature, you don't need to be told that. You have 2 hours to be told that. But The Boy and the Heron doesn't have that time. It has roughly 10 to 15 minutes to make you understand what Mahito stands for. And once that is done, it moves on. Past that stage, the movie is not concerned with character development anymore. If you haven't paid attention, you are completely lost. So, when you end up with a scene, for example, in the movie where Mahito takes a rock and smashes the rock on his own head, this is extremely confusing because there are so many layers of comprehension to that action, but you'll understand none of them if you haven't understood the emotional baggage that the boy carries on his shoulders. So this is what I personally understood of this scene, that this was Mahito's attempt at making the injury that he received from the boys that bully him worse in order to get the kids in trouble. I don't believe that's why he did this, but this is what it looks like from the outside. Then, if you pay attention to his psychology, you could also perceive that as a way to force his dad to pay attention to him. Because ever since they got to this new house, his dad is working super hard, he's taking care of his new wife, but he's not taking care of his son. So Mahito thought, okay, if I'm not injured enough as is for him to actually pay attention, but if I smash my head in with a rock, he will be forced to pay attention. Then, more sinister, it could also be a form of self-harm. Because Mahito is suffering internally, and he as a young boy doesn't know how to deal with it because he has no one in his life to help him. So what he does is he tries to externalize the pain by inflicting a wound onto his own person so as to feel in control. Because now the pain is something tangible he can touch. It's something on his head. It's something that is physical, as opposed to this emotional damage that he carries inside that he doesn't quite know what to do with. And that's stupid. But we saw in the movie that Mahito himself seems surprised at his own action because times and times again he touches the bandage like, why did I even do that to myself? So that's, again, great character development. It's to show that, yeah, he's a young boy. He acted on instinct, impulsively, he had no idea what he was doing. And it could also be an attempt to join his mom in death, because we know that Mahito feels extremely guilty because he was unable to save her, to the point again that if you look at the opening scene, it looks like he's throwing himself into the fire to be with her. So this could have just been again an attempt at doing the exact same thing, but in the real world. The problem again being that all of this interpretation is almost at the level of like psychoanalysis, and it happens way too fucking fast. So I read a ton of critics to prepare for this video. I know that the scene of the rock confused the majority of people. Or like they would say, well, I do not understand why he does that. What is the reason behind it? And that is a massive issue because the scene of the rock is also important to understand the rest of the movie. So now you didn't understand Mahito, you didn't understand the scene that triggers the rest of the movie. You're very unlikely to then be able to actually enjoy the movie or get the message of the movie because you feel disconnected from the main character. And I cannot think of a single Ghibli movie that does that. And it begins a trend of general confusion that makes connecting to the characters of the movie extremely difficult because their personalities and goals are very poorly defined. And the best example I have of this, outside of Mahito, is Natsuko. If you've watched the movie, were you not super surprised by the first interaction she has with Mahito? The first thing she tells him is, "Hi, I'm your new mom, and oh, you're gonna be a brother." He lost his mom just recently, he's now going to lose his dad to you, and now you announce that you're going to replace his mom, that he hasn't mourned yet, and you're going to have a baby that is going to take even more attention from him. When I saw that, I was like, okay, she's the villain of the movie. Because what is this? She's so cruel. That is emotionally cruel to say that. But then, right after this, she transitions into a doting mother, and then she's all over Mahito, and she's super nice to him, and super caring, which is confusing because it's not consistent. A character, even in a fiction, is supposed to be consistent within its own set of actions. If you cannot predict what a character is going to be doing, you cannot connect with the character. And you could tell me that it doesn't really matter, it's just one relationship that's poorly defined, but that's the relationship of the movie. The entire movie centers around it because at some point, Mahito is going to go on a quest to save her. And if they have this weird disjointed relationship, then why exactly is he doing that? Because right after these two completely disconnected interactions were, on one hand, she was a complete idiot to him, and then she was super caring, she disappears. She literally goes into the forest and leaves. So the amount of interactions we have between the two is extremely scarce, which then makes it feel like all of this was just a big plot device. We don't know or understand why the main character would care about her enough to go into the forest to try and look for her, but at the same time, that's the plot of the movie, so I guess we have to go through with it. And this is what I felt like throughout the entire story of The Boy and the Heron. It's like there was a number of things that had to happen, and they bent the character's actions so as to make sure that these things would happen, even if, emotionally speaking, they made no sense whatsoever. So now, instead of having organic characters where the plot develops around them because of their actions, we have instead a plot that bends the characters to its will, which then makes them feel like robots. And that is so unlike Ghibli movies and Miyazaki, because usually their characters are so vibrant and are so real. They feel like real people that exist in a real universe, which then makes you believe that the universe actually exists. And this is not limited to Mahito, it's not limited to Natsuko. The entire cast feels like this. The entire cast feels like robots, but worse than robots. They feel like caricatures of Ghibli characters. They have none of the warmth, they have none of the complexity or depth of all of the characters that we know and love so much. Instead, they are simply archetypes. So they are archetypes that fulfill one role, and that role is what the plot needs for the story to go forward. But the problem is that there is no justification for them being there. If you look at Mononoke, if you look at Spirited Away, every character, every archetypal character is there because it makes sense within the universe. Here, some of the characters feel like they've been plugged from another story and just planted there. And because of that, they feel forced. And the best example of that is the dad. Shoichi is a caricature, meaning that you take every dad in every Miyazaki movie ever and you have Shoichi. So he is super hardworking to the point where it's a bit ridiculous, he's never home, he's super bad with kids, he has the emotional intelligence of a spoon. Like, there are certain scenes in the movie that make you think, okay, you're a sociopath. There's no way you're that dumb. Like, for example, when he comes home, the first time he gets home, he left his son by himself in a house with a stranger for 10 hours. First thing you do as a dad is walk up the stairs, go into your son's room and kiss him. You know, cuddle him, put his blankets back on him, tell him you love him. What does he do? Comes home, gets tea and then goes to bed? What? And then he just says hi to his son at breakfast like nothing happened? I'm not saying that because the character is a negative depiction of masculinity. I'm fine with that. On the other hand, the character is also brave, he's willing to fight for his son. Clearly, he's not a bad person. But the problem is that he serves no purpose. He serves no function in the story. You take the dad away from the story and the plot doesn't change. He literally does nothing. Compare that with Totoro, where the dad also plays a secondary role, where the dad also is not the driving force of the story, which is perfectly fine, and you understand the issue. In Totoro, the dad not being present serves the plot, because that way the story can focus on the two sisters. Totoro is the story of two sisters who temporarily lost their mother to sickness, and who have to figure out things on their own because their dad is too busy working. Which then leads to the little one who doesn't quite understand the world around her, trying to go and meet her mom because she doesn't understand distances. So she tries to walk to the hospital, which is like miles and miles away, so she gets lost. Then you have the big sister who has to become a mother of sorts, but she's like 12 or something, so she has to deal with the emotional baggage and stress of becoming a parent at that young age. And of course, she cracks. She's suffering under all of these responsibilities that her dad is not able to shoulder, which then justifies the creation in their head of Totoro and the bus, which, you know, in the story seems to be creations of their imagination to lessen the pressure. They are imaginary friends that make the world seem more magical and less sinister. And that is a great self-contained story that makes a ton of sense. Then you look at Shoichi, the dad in The Boy and the Heron. Yeah, he's not taking care of Mahito, but that's not the reason why Mahito is the way he is. It's a small fraction of it. So now you end up with a trope that has been placed there because we needed to have the dad trope in the story. And another blatant example of this is Kiriko. So Kiriko is the stand-in, strong, independent female character. Miyazaki loves these characters, they're in every one of his movies. But again, usually, they're well written and they're interesting because they have a lengthy backstory that justifies them being the way they are. What we get instead in The Boy and the Heron is a token, tough female character. And it saddens me to say that because usually it's Hollywood who doesn't know how to write female characters properly. But in this case, Kiriko is just a bad character. Yes, she's cool, and yeah, when you saw her, you were like, oh man, she reminds me of all of these core characters from other movies. That's the issue. Her self, her contained self, is not good. What she makes you think of, what she makes you remember, and the nostalgia associated with her trope and archetype is the good thing. And usually when you have to rely on nostalgia to create characters that are impactful, it's because you have nothing else to say. Because in the movie, she serves no purpose. She appears out of nowhere to save the hero, then she teaches the hero a few things, which is, again, a recurrent theme in Miyazaki movies, that is great, but then she disappears. She just vanishes from the plot entirely, and she just reappears at the end when it's convenient to save Natsuko, but that's not a character. That's called a plot device. She's an empty archetype that we've seen a million times before that just fulfills functions. So she's much closer to a machine than she is to an actual character. Let's compare that to another tough and independent female character from Mononoke with Lady Eboshi. Eboshi, in this case, is one of the central part of the plot because she's the reason why nature is being destroyed. She's the person who angered the gods, and then she's the person who hunts and kills a god. That's a lot of information about the character, and it's a lot of things that she does that directly impact the plot. And on top of that, because she's so important, the movie makes sure to spend a lot of time explaining why she's doing things. Unlike Kiriko, who does things but you have no idea why, here you understand that Lady Eboshi is someone who suffered at some point or the other, who has developed, therefore, a tendency to be aggressive and rash, but it's because deep down, she's not entirely a bad person. So we see that, for example, with the way she treats the girls that she takes care of. She saved them from prostitution and she gave them a job, a house, a roof, food, and protection. We also see the way she treats the lepers. She's very kind to them even though they have been rejects of society, most likely because she herself understands what it feels like to be rejected. So all these things combined make her a super interesting character, and you can actually directly pinpoint these things and say, okay, this is why she's so tough, this is why she's so independent, she doesn't want to rely on others, she wants other people to rely on her, she wants responsibility, and for that she needs to be strong because she's a leader of men. So it's not just that she's badass, it's that the archetype of the badass female character is justified by the world that she lives in. And so she feels real. And she feels like an actual historical character that could have existed in feudal Japan. The same is not true for Kiriko, because even though she's given a token function in the story, you never exactly understand what is it she's doing, and you never really quite get what got her in that situation in the first place, because the universe around her is a mystery. This entire portion of the story where there's the sea, there's these monsters in the sea, all of that is nice and well, and if we had time to develop this part of the story, maybe we could have understood why she's so badass. Well, the story doesn't even know that. I don't know if you caught that line. When I saw that line, I was like, what? The character of Kiriko literally says, I don't even remember getting there. She doesn't even have a backstory. Within the actual brain of the creator, she doesn't even know why she's there because the creator, Miyazaki, doesn't even know why she's there. And you could come up with theories to explain this. So, for example, what I found was the fact that maybe she was brought to the universe as an infant by the uncle, so as to fulfill the function of feeding the shadow people. But okay, great. Why doesn't she remember anything then? Did he brainwash her? And then when he returns back to the actual world she came from, she goes right back to serving the family. So what is the lesson in this? Like, she's not really a badass female character. She's an actual slave. She was brainwashed into doing something she did not understand in complete solitude for decades, and then once that is done, she just returns back to being a servant. Because her character, maybe you didn't even notice that, is one of the old ladies. Kiriko is one of the old ladies. And as an old lady, she also has no character whatsoever because her entire personality is she's a scaredy cat, which completely contradicts the fact that she used to be a badass, and she likes to smoke. There's not much to work with here. So what we see is, once again, someone who was placed in the story because Miyazaki wanted a strong female character, but he had no function for her, so she's just there. And some people might just shrug their shoulders and say, okay, well, I don't care about that. I personally am a huge fan of Ghibli movies. Like, I'm a complete nerd. And if you're still watching at this point, you're a nerd as well. Don't give me that. Don't you find that this is a bit insulting to, take these characters from the grave, these archetypes from the grave, from these great movies, then plug them there like, okay, here's the archetype you love so much, you're happy? Well, I'm personally not happy at all. And this is why I did not like this movie. After that, there's other characters I could get into, like, for example, the old people in the house. They don't even have names. That's how little they're developed. You don't even know what they are. When I saw the trailer for the movie, I thought they were monsters. I thought they were gnomes. Turns out they're just old people. Like, they're literally just old people. And the question is, why so many of them? If you're not going to bother actually developing any of them, why did you put so many? It's like The Hobbit. Sorry, I'm all over the place, but it's a long discussion, so why not? It's like the Hobbit movies. Why did you need to have so many dwarves? Like, you name 5 of them, and then the rest, we don't even know what they do. That's a waste of space, and it's bad movie making. It should not be done. Although I might just be salty because I love old people in Miyazaki movies, like old Kamaji is my favorite character in Spirited Away. So it pisses me off that they were not actually developed or used in any way whatsoever. And then, worse, not only are they not developed, they're just turned into plot devices again because whenever convenient, whenever the main characters need information, magically, the old people know about the information and they can share it with them, but they conveniently waited the last second to do so. This is robotic behavior, and so instead of feeling like actual people, the characters of the boy and the heron feel like NPCs. They feel like characters you interact with to get a quest, and then when you leave them alone, they just stand there and they do nothing. Isn't that how it felt with the old people in the house? Unless Mahito, Natsuko, or Shoichi are interacting with them, they don't actually exist. They're just there and they do nothing. So overall, it just feels like Miyazaki took heroes from different stories and he put them all in the same movie. But the issue when you do that is that there's not enough space for the characters to be developed. So you end up with characters who have to compete for screen time, which at the end of the day means that they're all going to be underdeveloped. But the worst example of this by far is the Grey Heron, which, by the way, is the literal namesake of the movie. He should be one of the most detailed characters, but instead he's completely wasted. Because for Kiriko and the old people, I can sort of forgive because I did not see much potential in them. But with the Heron, I mean, the start of the movie, the Heron is a strong character. I don't know how you felt at the start, but for the first time in a long time, I actually felt scared. Because the Heron was like a threatening presence because you didn't know what it was. This is number one rule of a good horror movie. Never reveal what the monster is. The longer you can keep the monster in the shadows, the scarier it becomes. This is why The Thing by John Carpenter is one of the best movies of all time. Because even at the end of the runtime, you don't quite know what you're dealing with. Here, it started like this, where you and I watching this, we didn't know what the Heron was, the characters didn't, Mahito was clearly afraid of the Heron, and this is the one part where you connect with the character and you thought, oh yeah, I'm afraid of the Heron too, be afraid of him. But then, because the movie doesn't have any time to waste, we quickly move from what I call the introduction phase at the house, where you present the characters, into the big adventure, where now things happen super fast. And the issue is that within that phase of adventure, the Heron cannot just be a threatening presence because he would serve no purpose. So what Miyazaki does is that he takes him and he transforms him into a guide. Instead of having something to fear, something mysterious that the audience has to figure out, he turns the Grey Heron into a comic relief character. And I'm already opposed to that, personally, because it kills any tension that the movie had in the first place. Because the Heron was supposed to be the villain. So once he disappears, what do we have? For the rest of the movie, you don't even know what you're supposed to be afraid of. You know, you're fed the pelicans and you're fed the parrots, which are horrible villains. I'll talk about them later. But you're left with nothing. And that is an absolute shame, especially when you consider that the transition wasn't even done properly. Usually in Ghibli movies, things that are scary stay scary. And if they're not scary anymore, it's because something major happened. In The Boy and the Heron, the thing major that happens is that the uncle just tells the Heron, okay, stop being a dick and be the guide. And that's it, he transforms. And this feels horribly jarring also because not only is the tension gone like this, but also just the scene before, the Grey Heron traumatizes Mahito by creating a replica of his dead mom and then taunting him by saying, oh, well, maybe if you hadn't touched her, she would have lasted longer. How do we go from this, which is like pure evil, to then me being able to laugh at the character and think, oh, look at him, he's so jolly and goofy. Like, I was completely disconnected from the character of the Heron from that point on because he didn't feel real to me anymore. And I'm not saying that to claim that characters must be one-dimensional, because that's also a strength of Miyazaki. His characters tend to be complex. But if you want a complex character, you have to spend time developing the character, and then you have to explain why the changes occur. Let's take a great example from Spirited Away. So in Spirited Away, there is this character called Kaonashi, which you might know as the Faceless Man. And if you pay attention, his character arc is extremely similar to the Heron in the movie that we're talking about here. But the big difference, the massive difference, is what happens at the end of their character arc. So if you pay attention, the Faceless Man starts as a harmless presence. He's just something in the background. He's the mysterious shadow. He intrigues the audience and he intrigues the hero, but it stops there. And it's the exact same with the Heron. At the start, you don't know what he is. He's just a question mark. Then he becomes a threat. So the Faceless Man becomes this gigantic monster who eats people. Just like the Heron reveals his true nature and realizes, okay, this guy is actually dangerous, I have to pay attention to him. But this is where the similarities end, because at this point in Spirited Away, when the Faceless Man transitions back into something harmless, it's because there's a message behind it. So the metaphor behind the character itself is that if you try to model your identity after what you think people will like, you're very likely to turn into a monster because you won't be true to yourself. Which is why, by the way, the character is called the Faceless Man. And it's also a testimony to the corrupting nature of power and of money, because he manages to gain people's friendship and love via money, but he quickly realizes that these people don't actually like him, they like the money. The only person who liked him for who he was Chihiro, and she liked him before the fake identity. So ultimately, when he transitions back into a friend, something harmless, it's done through that very same pattern. The thing is that this transformation of the Faceless Man takes the entire movie, whereas with the Heron, it takes literally 1 second. And this is the reason why, ultimately, the Faceless Man is a complex and interesting character, and the Grey Heron isn't, because he is empty. And I say he's empty because if you try to question why he became friends with Mahito, the only answer you can give is because he was forced to. He was literally ordered to. And you could say that he acts like this because Mahito helped him fix his beak. But first, it was Mahito in the first place who tried to kill him with an arrow, and two, that just looks like an excuse for the movie to show that Mahito is kind. But if you compare it again to Spirited Away, in Spirited Away, Chihiro is kind to the Faceless Man for no reason whatsoever. And this is, by the way, the sign of a good movie, where characters do things because they're actual real in their universe, and real people do random things. They don't need a reason for everything they do. In The Boy and the Heron, Mahito fixes the beak because he needs the Heron as a guide. He's not doing that out of kindness. And talking about the relationship between these two, there's also something that you might have caught that is never explained, and that is the number 7 feather. So the number 7 feather is apparently a magical feather on the Heron's body that is his big weak point. The entire story about Mahito finding the feathers and making the arrow and shooting the Heron and then the Heron becoming weak and needing Mahito, all of this is also a plot device. It's not even a story within the story because it makes no sense whatsoever for the following reason. So in the story, Mahito just so happens to pick up exactly the right feather from the ground. So there are multiple feathers on the Heron's body, but the one that fell and the one that Mahito finds is the number 7 feather, okay? That's already extremely convenient. Then after this, Mahito, for some reason, decides to put this feather on an arrow which, by the way, minutes later did not work. So did he think that putting feathers on an arrow makes it magically fly properly? The arrow was shit in the first place. So that's also not logical. Then it just so happens to be that the Heron's weakness is that very arrow, but it's not a fatal weakness, because if it was, he would die and then Mahito would have no guide. So the feather and the arrow doesn't actually kill him, it just weakens him enough that he now has to depend on the hero for help, because conveniently also, the only person who can fix the beak of the heron once he was shot with the arrow is the person who shot the arrow. Put like this, it all feels super forced. And it also feels completely opposed to Miyazaki's usual style that tends to be super smooth and seamless, where here it's super clunky. So I thought that maybe it was like an attempt at telling a message. And what I concluded was that maybe the fact that the dynamics between the characters feel so forced is because it serves as a metaphor of Mahito's living situation. So the fact that he was literally plugged into a house with a bunch of people he knows nothing about, that he has no connection to. So you have that scene, for example, with the old people when they all have dinner and they're all in a line and no one is facing each other, and Mahito is clearly not having a good time and he leaves. That was my number one interpretation, and it might also be a definitive attempt on Miyazaki's part at making the characters feel obtuse on purpose, so as to make it harder for us to connect with them, almost as like a meta discourse where within the story, the adults struggle to understand what Mahito is going through, just like we struggle to understand what he's going through, because we have nothing to connect with. The characters are emotionally very flat, or they're very confusing. It's just my attempt to try and interpret what I perceive as movie flaws, because maybe there's a meaning that I don't understand. But here's the thing. How can you expect people to actually understand any of what I just explained here when the movie doesn't even give you time to breathe? And this is what perplexed me a bit when I saw that the number one critic that people had against the movie was that it was too slow. I don't know if we saw the same movie, but I have the exact opposite critic. To me, the movie is way too fast. The movie moves at 100 miles an hour, it never gives you time to breathe, unlike other Ghibli movies that tend to be contemplative in nature, where there are literal scenes that are useless, but it's fine that they're useless because they pace down the story. Like in Spirited Away, there's that scene where Chihiro is just sitting looking at the sea and she's eating like a rice bun. Okay, nothing happens here, the plot is not moving forward, but that's fine. It's a moment of respite for the character that allows you to realize that she's a young girl going through some very difficult things. She's now forced to work to survive. She doesn't know where her parents are. All of this is a lot, but this is the type of moment that allows you to connect to the character. This is the reason why in action movies, for example, character development is not important, because the action is what you have to pay attention to. When you look at Expendables, who gives a fuck what character with big biceps number 18 thinks of life or his relationship with grief? That's not the point of the movie. It's explosions and people dying. But when I watch a Ghibli movie, I want the exact opposite. I want something that is slow-paced so that I can actually understand what is going on. I think that the movie would have benefited from being a bit more boring. And it could have been done very easily by simply making sure that the bulk of the story takes place at the house. Because between the heron, between the old people, the tower, you have Mahito, you have Shoichi, Natsuko. That's plenty. You can do a lot with just that. And after this, once this introduction phase is over and you have developed the characters and their relationships, we can then move on to the dimension, the parallel dimension of the tower, where the end of the story can be revealed. I think that this would have been much smoother and it would have been much better. But because you have this entire scene with Kiriko in the middle, it just kills the flow entirely and it just bombards the viewer with too much information that is not needed, as I just described. And I speak as someone who loved the scene with Kiriko because I absolutely love the sea. And the sea is not a theme that is very developed in Ghibli movies, save for Ponyo. So when I saw that, I was like, damn, okay, I hope that we spend a lot of time here. But then what happens? 10 minutes later, you're dragged by the foot like a kid that is being taken out of a candy store by the parent, and you're just plunged into something else. And I was looking at the screen like, why? Why are you doing this to me, movie? This looked so cool. Why didn't you develop the wood? Because Kiriko's wood, and I'm repeating myself, I think, but is not developed at all. We have no idea of what's going on. and yet it seemed to be so very interesting. And to add insult to injury, the transition and the new word that comes after this one is even less developed because you spend literally 2 minutes in it. So we leave the Wood of the Sea to enter the blacksmith. So it's that house that has been taken over by pirates. You don't know why. You don't even know who the blacksmith is. Why is it relevant to name the place if there's no character relevant to the name? And then Mahito enters the house and he's teleported into a new place. So what was the point of that place in the first place? Because keep in mind that the entire thing with Kiriko is supposedly here to introduce Lady Hemi so that you can start to think in your head, oh, she might be Mahito's mom, but then she appears in that other universe to teleport her son into a new place. Why did this in-between place need to exist? Again, it literally just felt like something that Miyazaki wanted in the movie, even though it did not fit within the plot, so he just said, you know what, fuck the plot, let's just put that in the movie. And this is what we're going to be talking about next, namely the insane amount of plot holes in this movie. And it pains me to say that, because usually Ghibli movies are airtight, but this one drops the ball big time. Which is surprising because Miyazaki's strength, again, is to create words that are highly original, but also highly coherent within their own universe. So, regardless of how crazy or out there they might be, at the end of the movie, they make sense. Example, Spirited Away. If you look at the bathhouse, which is the main setting of the movie, yes, at the start, it's confusing and you don't know what it is. It's part of the charm of the movie. But then, the more the movie advances, the more information you are given, to the point that at the end of the movie, I can show you a random character and ask you, hey, what does this guy do in the bathhouse? And you would be able to answer this. Or I could ask you, hey, what is the function of the bathhouse? And who are the clients of the bathhouse? And you would also be able to answer that. That is a movie that has actually done its job properly. Another good example is Nausicaa. The universe of Nausicaa is exotic. You have the toxic jungle. You have the massive insects. An insect the size of a dinosaur, even more than a dinosaur, like a skyscraper. Who could believe that? Well, I can, because the universe of Nausicaa explains why the insects exist, why the toxic jungle exists, why there is a war, etc., etc. So you get the best of both. You get the magical journey of a Ghibli movie, but you also get a solid message and, more importantly, a solid narration. Narration is everything. If you have a movie with too many things that serve no narrative purpose, it confuses the viewers and it leaves the plot wide open, which then tends to lead to your suspension of disbelief suffering. And you could tell me, well, suspension of disbelief, these movies are all completely unrealistic. Why would you need that? Even when you watch science fiction, you need to maintain suspension of disbelief. You need to be able to tell yourself, okay, even though this universe clearly doesn't exist, within the universe itself, there are rules that must be respected. And as long as these rules are respected, I can accept the fact that the universe might actually exist because it's realistic within its own setting. But that requires actually giving the viewer information that holds up with time. So let's see if The Boy and the Heron manages to do that. First, let's look at the gateway to another world, because this entire story about parallel dimensions relies on one place and one place only, and that is the tower. It is the tower and its magical properties that allows the entire plot to go forth. So, are we ever explained what the tower is? Not really. We don't know. We know that it fell from the skies and that it's made of a magical crystal, but that's pretty much it. And it could be explained by saying that it's beyond human comprehension, which is fine, I guess. But at the same time, you have the entire thing about Mahito's bloodline. Well, they apparently understand the tower. They can even hear the tower speak to them, which is also never explained further. And since it's not explained further, how do you expect the audience to be able to believe in the word that is created by the tower when we don't even understand what the tower is supposed to be in the first place? So since the universe has no rules, and you're not quite able to tell what should or shouldn't happen, everything feels like a deus ex machina, or in more vulgar terms, an ass pull. because you have no basis to judge what should make sense and what doesn't. So a good example of that was the number 7 feather, but this should somewhat be forgivable, I guess, because the impact on the plot is minor. Where it becomes a real problem, however, is when this level of narrative laziness spreads to character development. Because the entire plot of the movie is the fact that Mahito goes on a quest to get Natsuko back, and so that they can mend their relationship together, right? But the thing is that this relationship itself is based on a complete ass-pull, because their character arcs are completely nonsensical. So if we go back to the start, originally, this should have been the story of a young boy who realizes, with time, that blaming his stepmother for replacing his dead mother and for all of the misery in his life is not fair. It's not fair to him, it's not fair to his dad, it's not fair to his brother to come, and it is just making his life more miserable overall. So as a result of that, he should then start to work on himself, and he should start to work on the relationship with Natsuko so as to fix that issue. That is how problem solving works. That is how character development works. But the problem that I outlined earlier when I spoke about the characters is that Natsuko disappears way before Mahito has that realization. So once he does realize what is to be done, it's already too late because she's already out. And worse than that, even the realization itself is forced because the epiphany that Mahito has is caused by a book that he finds that his mom left him, and the book very conveniently contains advice on this specific situation. Like, what are you to do if I die in a fire and then I get replaced by my sister? Which you could tell me, okay, this makes sense because she knew she was going to die, and I'll accept it, which is also why, by the way, the title of the movie was supposed to be How Do You Live? It's also the title of the book. It's a question directly from Mahito's mother to Mahito as a way to force him to actually introspect and realize that all of his problems are his own fault. Okay, so then Mahito has a reason to go on a quest to find Natsuko. And that's great for the plot. But in terms of character development, nothing happened for it to make sense. What I mean by this is that so far what we have in terms of interaction between the two is you have Natsuko, who was insensitive to Mahito at the start of the movie, and then you have Mahito, who was a complete dick to Natsuko because when she was sick, he enters her room and he's like, yeah, I don't really care about you. He completely disregards her well-being, which then motivates her to leave the house, which is also weird. Like, you have beef with your stepson, so you leave the house pregnant to go into a wood that you know nothing about that could potentially be dangerous, and you abandon your husband that did nothing. This is really confusing because the characters act completely unhinged. But the reason why they feel unhinged is because they're poorly written, because they're plot devices. There was no reason for Natsuko to act like this at the start. The movie needed her to act like this so as to give Mahito a reason to dislike her. Then we needed a reason for Natsuko to leave to the forest, so Mahito started acting like a dick to her for no reason whatsoever, which is also a convenient excuse because now Mahito has a reason to go into the alternate universe, so that, hey, the plot can advance again. And this is exactly what I meant when I said that the characters are just slaves to the plot. Because if you look at what I just described, none of this actually makes sense. There is no reason for the characters to act like this. It's just that there was a storyline, and for the storyline to be completed, certain things had to happen. But that is very poor storytelling. And the issue with poor storytelling is that usually the payback fucking sucks. So in this case, their character arc together, which should have been great, it should have been this emotional moment where they finally reunite and they realize their mistakes and they accept each other as family. Instead of that, it's a shot-for-shot recreation of the previous scene. So in the first iteration, Mahito enters Natsuko's room. She's sick, but he doesn't care. He doesn't really want to be there. He was forced to be there against his will, and he does something very selfish. He steals. Then, when he returns the second time in the birthing room, she's sick again, he visits her, but this time he's completely selfless. He's there to check on her and he's there to save her. So when that plot thread finally resolves, the most important one in the movie, something should happen, but nothing does because the work done previously that should have gotten us involved in the characters was botched. There were emotions that could have occurred, but they didn't because whoever created the story was so intent on making sure that the plot would go forward that they never stopped to think for a second if the plot made sense. And the fact that Mahito's mom appears in the movie is not bad in itself. I'm not saying you have to restrict the cast to one female character that interacts with the hero. I'm saying, however, that if you have multiple female characters, regardless of their relationship with the hero, mom, sister, romantic interest, it has to be done properly. And a good example of that is Mononoke. In Mononoke, Ashitaka has relationships, quote unquote, with Princess Mononoke, but also with Lady Eboshi. One is a friendship / romantic relationship, the other one is a rivalry, and it works beautifully. Why? Because the two are clearly separated. In The Boy and the Heron, the two sisters, one look alike, two are almost indistinguishable. Their characters are too similar, and their character arcs and relationships with Mahito also are. And that's the point, sort of, because the sister is supposed to replace the mom as Mahito's new mom. So there is meaning behind it. But as I said, since there's not enough time to develop any of it, it feels botched and it's super confusing. Because the main cast of the movie, if I were to narrow it down to the most important characters, would comprise Mahito, Himi, the Great Heron, Kiriko, the uncle, and Natsuko. Of course, it's not going to be possible. No other Ghibli movie has that big of a main cast. You can count them all. Most of the time you have 3, 4, maybe 5 main characters that you have to pay attention to. And this is why these characters end up being so well developed and why the plot that they drive tend to be so strong. Because ultimately, Ghibli movies are character driven. So the world that is created around them only really serves as an excuse to force the characters to grow and to push that plot. But if neither your universe nor your characters make any sense, is it really any wonder that the plot wouldn't make sense either? With this movie, it feels like they focused so much on making the visuals as beautiful as possible that they forgot that what makes Ghibli movies beautiful in the first place is the fact that there's meaning behind the visuals. The Boy and the Heron might be the most beautiful Ghibli movie of all time. Some of the shots, you want to take them and frame them and put them in your house because they're that gorgeous. But the issue is that they mean nothing. If you take, for example, Mononoke, you think about the woods, you think about the fog, the smog that surrounds the woods. All beautiful depictions of natures that mean something. They're not just beautiful because there are trees and they're green and it's pretty. It's because all of this is symbolical. It reminds us of the importance of nature, but also its fragility. Because times and times again in the movie, you have devastated landscapes that look like the moon, where man came and burnt everything to the ground. And it's this juxtaposition between the horrors of the Industrial Revolution and the beauty of nature that makes you realize the importance of preserving the beauty of nature. And the same goes for every Ghibli movie. Usually the most memorable scene in these films is not the one that is the most aesthetically pleasing. It's the one that carries the most meaning because it stays with you. It's memorable. The problem is that The Boy and the Heron is the exact opposite. It's not memorable at all, to the point that right now I'm struggling to picture any of the beautiful settings and visuals I saw in the movie because they were connected to absolutely nothing. People remember the way you make them feel, not the way things look. Be honest for 1 second. If you like the movie and you think that I'm wrong, how many times did you feel emotionally moved by this movie as opposed to Spirited Away or Mononoke? For me, the answer is simple. 0. I didn't really feel anything towards the movie because it felt like I was in a museum, but I only got like 20 seconds to look at every painting. I had no time to actually take things in and let the emotions do the work. Even a movie like Totoro, that many people deride, saying that it has no plot, Totoro's plot crushes The Boy and the Heron. Even though it's much more self contained. Because it is much more self contained, it does a much better job at telling a story. And then there's also the fact that the movie, by nature, is unoriginal. Because most of the most spectacular scenes in The Boy and the Heron are literally copy pasted from other movies. So I noted, for example, the scene of the fish and the frogs when Mahito is being like enveloped by the frogs and the fish sing. That's a great scene, but the issue is that it's taken straight from Pompoko when they invoke the demons, so it's nothing new. Then you have the scene of the birthing room, which is Spirited Away. I mean, the thing with like the paper flips that envelope people, it has been done before. And yes, it's beautiful. Yes, it's artistic, but in Spirited Away, it meant something. In The Boy and the Heron, it's just there because it looks pretty, I guess, which to me only constitutes empty sensationalism. And I expect better from Ghibli movies. Again, Hollywood is good at that. They'll give you explosions and pretty 3D effects and CGI. Great, it's movies for idiots, there's no meaning behind it. But not in my Ghibli movies. Likewise, for the scene where the universe crumbles, everything is destroyed and you have Mahito and Himi who are running away. If you watched The Cat Returns, same exact scene as when the tower just falls apart. If you watch Oz Moving Castle, when the castle falls apart, same exact scene. Even the storyline itself is essentially copied from other movies. So the start of the movie is Grave of the Fireflies. Then you have the entire portion of the house that feels a lot like Totoro. And I know what you might say to this. They're Ghibli movies, and they're all made by Miyazaki. Of course they're going to be similar. That's not what I'm claiming here. Naturally, there's going to be some things that look alike between movies. But compare, for example, Porco Rosso and Pompoko. Compare Spirited Away and Oz Moving Castle. These are not the same universes, there are different sets of rules, and ultimately you feel like these are two different entities. When I watched The Boy and the Heron, it's not what it felt like. As I said, it literally felt like characters were pulled from different movies and stories, and slight portions of the universe was pulled from every other Ghibli movie and just patched together to make something new. But that is not actually something new. And that is criminal when you realize the amount of time and energy that went into that movie. The fact that 10 years of production by Miyazaki, the genius Miyazaki, could fail to produce anything remotely original it's a travesty. And I understand that it was the point. I know that they did this on purpose. The entire thing is supposed to be a celebration of Miyazaki's work. So naturally, he's going to do all of the things that he's done in the past. And this is also why the audience and the critics reacted so positively to the movie. It's because they got fed what they're used to. They got fed the original formula that fills them with nostalgia because it reminds them of their childhood. It reminds them of that specific movie that has a particular place in their heart. But that to me is getting dangerously close to what Disney is doing nowadays, where they have no new ideas, so they just recycle old movies, knowing for a fact that they're going to be able to sell because of nostalgia. But when you rely on it, and you just do what used to be done because it worked, and you try to combine all of these elements at once, what ends up happening is that you have a finished product that is entirely nonsensical. Because a movie is not just the sums of its parts. You can't just pick and choose from this story and that story and just put it all together and hope that the creature, the Frankenstein you just created, is going to have a beating heart and is going to be able to touch people. Because what's missing from this creature is a spine. It's the ability to stand on its own. This movie does not stand on its own. And that would have been fine if the goal of the movie was to be purely contemplative, but as we know, it's not, because it might be the most ambitious Miyazaki movie of all time, seeing how complex the plot is. Now that I explained why both the characters and the plot of the movie are lackluster, we can move on to the themes. And as I said, since the movie is extremely ambitious, there are many. I personally counted five. Five main themes that are war, grief, creation, family, and humanity. 5 is a lot, meaning that for a Ghibli movie, usually they have between 2 to 3. So if I were to give you an example, Spirited Away has 2 main themes, childhood and friendship. And it doesn't stop Spirited Away from being great. You don't need a gazillion themes. As long as the themes are developed properly, you're fine. Mononoke, for example, has 3 themes. You have nature, war, and divinity/worship. And if you look at the roster of Miyazaki movies, I think that Mononoke is the one that is the heaviest in terms of symbolism, to the point that it actually is also a movie that is very plot-driven, where there's a lot of action. But it has a runtime of 2 hours and 10 minutes. If you compare it with The Boy and the Heron, which has a runtime of 2 hours and 4 minutes, you understand the gap between the two. Mononoke has 3 themes. In the same time, The Boy and the Heron is trying to tackle 5. That's not possible. As I said, Mononoke is already action-packed when it comes to Ghibli movies. Spirited Away has the same runtime with 1 less theme, which explains why the movie is much more laid back, it's much more leisurely, and it's also much more contemplative. You have much more time to breathe. This teaches us that the pacing of the movie is directly impacted by its ambition. If you try to tackle too many things, you're going to have to go very fast, which leads to today's discussion, because it's exactly what happened to The Boy and the Heron. If it feels rushed and if it feels short-winded, it's because at the start, what they tried to create was way too ambitious, and they should have realized that they would not have the time to do so. But because they decided to just go ahead regardless, what you end up with is an unfinished product, because the majority of the themes in the movie are grossly underutilized. So let's start with war. War is what the movie starts with, because the movie takes place in 1940s Japan in the middle of World War II, which is made immediately evident because the first event in the story that precipitates the rest of the intrigue is the fact that Mahito's mom's factory is firebombed and she dies in it. And there are many scenes after that that remind you of that fact. Because, for example, at the start of the movie, Mahito bows down to soldiers who come by. There's also the scene, it's a great scene, it's a shame that it's underutilized, but there's the scene of the elderly who receive food and are all excited because since it's wartime, usually the only thing they have to eat is what they can produce. So when they get their hands on canned food or tobacco, of course, it's like Christmas to them. Now, the thing with these scenes is that they're extremely quick, and on top of that, they don't really take away from the movie. So the fact that they don't have a payback is fine. It doesn't really matter. Where it becomes an issue is when you spend actual time telling the audience something, and the audience actually doesn't get to see that thing come to fruition. So Shoishi's father runs a factory, he's a capitalist, and he creates weapons, he creates airplanes, which is something that I, as the viewer, thought was going to be important, but it turned out to not be at all, because the theme of war is then completely abandoned because Mahito leaves the wood. So he leaves the plane of existence where the war is occurring, he goes on to this alternate universe where it's not relevant at all, but then he comes back, and at the end of the movie, war is relevant again because they tell you that 2 years after World War II, they left the house. Okay, great, but what are you trying to tell me with this? Are you trying to tell me that war is bad? If yes, other Miyazaki movies already did that much better. So it really only looks to me like it was something that Miyazaki wanted to shoehorn in the movie because he likes the theme, but then he had no use for it, so it went nowhere. Then we have the theme of grief, which should be the movie's central theme because it's what impacts the main character the most. But the issue is that to depict grief properly, you need time. And the movie doesn't have any time. It has 10 minutes at the start and that's it. After that, character development is over and the action starts. So, once the hero is past that phase where he has nightmares, we don't really talk about it anymore. He starts to hyper-focus on the Heron. Then there's that scene where he sees the literal corpse of his mom melt in front of him, and he has no reaction. Because just like the audience, he seems to be disconnected with this entire thing in his head. He's already moved on. But that is so incoherent emotionally. Like, what young boy is not going to break down in tears if he sees his mom die a second time? That, to me, makes no sense, but it participates again in the poor development of the character. Then he goes on to a quest to save Natsuko, which is a replacement, quote-unquote, for his mom, which is fine, because it's the plot of the story. But again, this means that the theme of grief is nowhere to be found. And then the final nail in the coffin of that theme is the fact that his mom is alive in the movie when she was young. So there is a young version of her called Himi, which then of course means that he's not going to spend any time being sad. She's literally right there and he can spend time with her. Then we find out that she didn't actually die in his wood because she's a magical girl, I guess. She's connected to fire. So her body was never really burned, it just transferred into a different dimension, which is a very convenient excuse to explain why Mahito is not supposed to feel sad about the death of his mom. But then again, why did you introduce the topic of grief if you are just going to sweep it under the rug afterwards? That just looks to me like the movie didn't have enough time to allow Mahito to deal with his emotions, so instead they found another asshole to justify why he shouldn't have emotions in the first place. I don't know about you, but personally, knowing that my mom is essentially a fire elemental and that she didn't really die wouldn't make me feel better about it at all because she's still gone. She's still not in my life. So the fact that she just moved on to a new plane of existence is no consolation. And again, to a young boy, Mahito is very young, it should be no consolation either. He's way too mature for his age. But at the same time, he's also horribly immature in other places, which is because sometimes the plot needs Mahito to be mature and sometimes it needs him to act like a boy, but from an outside perspective, it's just completely incoherent. Then you have the theme of the family, and that's another great asshole because the start of the movie again tells you that this is going to be about a dysfunctional family that is moving into a new house and trying to settle down and become a coherent unit once again so that everyone can be happy, but there are issues and problems that get in the way of that happiness and they have to resolve it. The problem is that to resolve it, you would need to have the characters under the same roof, but since very quickly the story moves on to another setting, that plot point is transferred into something else, and now the big resolution of the entire family theme is supposed to be whenever Mahito manages to find Natsuko, which as we covered earlier should change nothing to their relationship, but in the movie it magically does. Then you get a 2-year ellipse, after which everything is fixed. So you don't know why, because the movie refuses to show you, but after that, they're happy together, they're a happy family, they have the new baby, and everything is perfect. It's a perfect life. Great, I would have liked to see that. This is actually what I went to the movie to. This is what I expected. So as a result, again, you feel no emotion. This ending that should make you feel good for Mahito and make you feel, oh great, he finally surpassed his trauma and grief, makes you just think like, okay, I guess you magically resolved it off screen. And this is why so many people, by the way, complain about the ending. It's because, yeah, it's just brutal and it's undeserved. You're again told, hey, look at a happy family. Don't you feel happy for them? Well, no, because I don't feel connected to them or the story that led them to finally be happy. Which is not usually true for Ghibli movies, which have a reputation for happy endings because at the end of the runtime, usually everything is resolved, everything is coherent, and you can feel good about the fact that the character went through the journey, completed the journey, and can now finally be happy. But that can be said for The Boy and the Heron, so at the end, you just feel frustrated and you feel like you want more. You feel like the movie hasn't given you enough to justify this ending. And when it comes to doors that the movie leaves open, the most obvious one is the theme of creation. So if you look, again, at the plot lines that the movie offers, one that is very important that I haven't really touched yet is the idea of the parallel dimension. Because whatever Mahito explores in reality was created by his ancestor, who is his mom's uncle, who essentially, for the purpose of the story, is an all-powerful demiurge. So he was able to create the entire universe from scratch. The problem is that this universe that ties into the theme of creation makes no sense. And because of that, you have a tough time even believing in the story in the first place. So the most obvious plot hole that I personally noticed is the theme or the idea of the Wara Wara, which are supposed to be these like squishy creatures that are actually unborn children. They're the soul of unborn children who then fly upwards to be born in the real world. So this tracks with the idea that this alternate universe is actually a form of underworld where the dead go once they pass from our world, and then they go through a cycle of rebirth and they get transformed into these creatures and they go back to the world, which is very interesting. Also not developed at all, and you have to guess it because everything I just shared with you is something that I interpreted. The movie never actually tells you any of that, and I think the reason for that is obvious. It's because these Wara Wara were just created as like a soft mascot that, again, Miyazaki loved to put in his movies. But if you take Mononoke, for example, with the spirits of the forest, sure, they serve no purpose, but they don't actively open plot lines that then are left completely unresolved. Because that's the problem with these fuckers in that movie. Sure, they're cute, but they also ask a lot of questions and we get zero answers. Why exactly does the uncle send the pelicans to eat them? What is the point of that? Why is he actively trying to kill unborn children? Especially when you take into account the fact that at the same time, he tasked his niece, Lady Himi, to shoot fire at the pelicans to make them go away so as to make sure they don't eat the Wara Wara. So which one is it? You want them to eat them or not? Because it would be one thing if these pelicans just appeared out of nowhere, but in this case, no. The movie tells us that the uncle brought them into the world on purpose because they're not creations. They actually come from the real world, and we know that because once they pass the door on the other side, they return back, they don't transform into anything. They stay the exact same. And that's another incoherence in a long line of problems that plague the characters because the uncle is also super contradictory in his behavior. Another example is, why exactly does he allow Mahito to get eaten by the parrots if he has control over the world and the parrots and he intends to make Mahito his successor? How does that make any sense? And all of this is never explained by the movie or the characters, which can be fine in small doses. Ghibli movies tend to be mysterious, they tend to be up for interpretation. But if you have to interpret 90% of the plot to be able to follow the action, then there is a problem with the plot itself. And I could go on and on and on. So, another batch of examples of plot threads that are left completely unresolved. Why is Mahito's bloodline special? That's never explained. What is the nature of that domain of the dead that Mahito attempts to open? That's never explained, even though, the domain looks pretty, but we don't know what it does. What is the significance of the fire ritual that Kiriko performs? It looks impressive, and I sort of guess that it's in a way to appease the spirits of the dead. But maybe if the movie had spent more time in that specific area of the universe, we could have had answers, and that might have actually been very interesting. The role of Kiriko, as I said, is not explained either. We don't know why the characters keep saying that Mahito reeks of death, considering that dialogue lines are valuable resources in The Boy and the Heron. It feels weird that they wasted so many of them repeating that information, even though it doesn't lead to anything or any payback. What about the shadow figures? The shadow figures are a mainstay in Miyazaki movies. If you look at Spirited Away, they're everywhere, but you know why they're here. They're explained. They have a purpose. Here, you're just told, oh, they're dead and they cannot kill things, but at the same time, they can eat. All right, why? These are the things that are mysteries that are worth actually exploring because these tend to be interesting things and hooks that catches the audience attention. This is how you keep the attention of the audience and you keep the audience engaged. But if at the end of the movie you don't give any answers to any of that, you just leave a bad taste in the mouth of the people who actually put in the effort to be involved in your work. And all of this culminates in the ultimate whole that completes the mess that is this movie's plot, namely the taboo. So, another recurring theme in Miyazaki work, he loves the idea of a taboo. He loves the idea of an action that must not be done or else consequences arise. In Spirited Away, you have the taboo of humans eating spirit food. If you eat the food of the spirits, you are turned into a pig. And this is vital to understand because once you do, you get why Chihiro has to go on that journey and the way she has to go about it. She cannot just find her parents, that's not enough. She has to find a way to reverse the curse, and to reverse the curse, she and the audience have to understand the taboo. This means that, since now the taboo is a plot device, it's going to be explained to the audience several times, and it's going to be a reoccurring theme, to the point that you even have a second taboo in the story of Spirited Away, when Haku stole the seal of Baba Yaga's sister, and he also gets a curse, which then leads to the entire development where he's fed the medicinal bowl, which allows him to spit out the curse, which gives hints and indications to Chihiro as to how she's supposed to save her parents. All of this makes perfect sense, and so the theme of the taboo in that story also makes perfect sense. You also have Mononoke. There is the curse that is opposed on the hero Ashitaka's arm, which then forces him to go on a journey to the east, I believe, to get rid of the curse. Perfect implementation of the taboo again. The problem is that in The Boy and the Heron, the taboo in itself is never explained, you don't know the rules around it, and you don't even know its origin, meaning that whatever real-world consequences arise if you break the taboo are also very unlikely to make any sense because the taboo itself doesn't make sense. And the worst thing is that, just like with Spirited Away, The Boy and the Heron has two taboos, and the first one is actually applied properly. The first one is, don't enter the tower or else you disappear. Okay, it's a simple taboo, but it works. It justifies why the character of Mahito and the character of Natsuko leave. They get pretty much sucked in a different dimension. Okay, great. But what about the second one? The second one is the birthing room taboo, meaning that you are not allowed to enter the room where Natsuko is going to quote-unquote give birth. That is never explained. You're told that Mahito is not to do that, and you can sort of guess. My guess was that since the entire alternate dimension is essentially an underworld, so a kingdom of the dead, interacting with newborns is taboo because you are going to soil them, and since they're sacred, you're not to do that, even though that's contradicted by the fact that the fucking pelicans eat the warawara, which are also unborn children. So again, even if you try to make sense of the universe, it still contradicts itself. So then that taboo being broken leads to the entire universe crumbling upon itself because Mahito doesn't care and he enters the birthing room, and by doing that, he triggers an event that I suppose makes the universe collapse. Again, never explained. You don't know if that's that or if it's just happenstance, and Mahito just so happened to enter the universe on the day it was going to crumble, even though it had stayed solid for decades before, which would also be an asshole. So I would personally prefer that it's the taboo that caused the entire destruction. So then, the only explanation we have for the end of the movie, because that's the series of actions that trigger the end of the movie, is the fact that apparently the rock, the tower, doesn't like it if you do that one thing, so shut up and just don't do it. A rock, again, that we know nothing about, we don't know where it came from, and it was never explained. So you see that it's really a culmination of many things that put together make it very hard to feel anything for the movie. Because we don't know the rules of this universe. So in a good movie, I should have felt something when Mahito breaks the taboo. I should have told myself, oh no, don't do that, it's going to be bad. But I don't know. I'm told afterwards that it's bad because I'm shown the consequences only after he does the thing. And on top of that, okay, great, you're destroying this universe, but I feel nothing for this universe. You did not spend enough time in it for me to feel attached to its characters or even to it as a creation. If anything, I was glad that the universe was destroyed, because the only people you meet in them are the parrots, and the parrots are monsters. So good riddance. You're actually happy that this entire thing goes to shit. And then there's the cherry on top of the shit sundae, which is the fact that you learn that there are hundreds of other dimensions just like this one. So it's essentially the movie telling you, hey, you see that dimension that just exploded, that we spent like 15 minutes in, that you know nothing about? Yeah, there are hundreds just like this, and you'll never get to explore them. I took that like as a middle finger. I didn't like that at all. I would have preferred to be left in the dark. But it also begs the question of who exactly created these other dimensions. Did the uncle create all of it? If that's the case, no wonder he couldn't handle all of it at once. But if it's someone else, great, another question that we will never get an answer to. And then that leads us to the final theme of humanity. And this is the part of the video where we get a bit loose and I start discussing philosophy. Because this movie is deeply philosophical, just like any Miyazaki movie. But the difference is that in this case, unlike others, just like Mononoke, where if you pay some attention, you're going to very easily understand the meaning behind the message, in this case, this is an exception because unless you're paying very close attention to a specific moment of the movie, you are going to be left in the dark. And that specific moment, if you have caught it, congratulations, is the point where the story shows you the portrait of the uncle when he was young, at which point, if you're into philosophy, you might have realized or recognized that he's made to look exactly like Friedrich Nietzsche. And it's also corroborated by the backstory. It's not just the visuals, because if you have paid attention, you have heard that the uncle went crazy after reading the wrong book. So he went crazy with knowledge, which is what in a romantic sense happened to Nietzsche, although we could also say that Nietzsche went crazy because of disease. And actually, once you see that, once you understand this, the story makes much more sense. Because now you can actually look for Nietzschean philosophy in the events and in the things that before that appeared completely obscure, and magically the meaning is revealed to you. So for example, if you look at the uncle, yeah, his entire thing of creating a universe is completely nonsensical because it contradicts itself all the time. But if you see it as someone who tried to apply will to power in an attempt to create a perfect world, but because of his human nature couldn't control that perfect world and ended up creating a form of hell, that makes a ton more sense. And it's actually super interesting. Then even the parrots make sense, because if you look at them, something that is said at some point is that they're a form of mold, meaning that because the uncle is not a god, he's just a human, when he attempted to create a perfect world with perfect beings in the world, he only really created monsters. And as monsters, as mold, the only thing they're able to do is to destroy. So their number one action in the movie is they just consume everything that they come into contact with. Which in a sense does make them a stand-in for us. Because the parrots are us. They behave exactly like humans. And if you know Miyazaki, he has a deeply misanthropist philosophy, and despite the hopeful nature of his movies, he does not hold humanity in very high regard at all, which is something you see in movies like Pompoko that deal with consumerism, with the impact of humanity on nature, with what modernity has done to the world, all of which is also present in The Boy and the Heron, but it's just not evident at all. For most people, the parrots are just another random, goofy villain that is only there to prevent the hero from reaching Natsuko, which on surface level they are. But at a second glance, you also see certain aspects of them that make you think that there is more to it. So for example, their king is very interesting because, yeah, he's very caricatural and he's only really there to serve as a foil to the uncle and Mahito. But even in that role, he fails entirely because he's completely incompetent. And also, he gets like, 5 minutes of screen time and like 2 lines of dialogue. Instead, what you have to pay attention to is his nature. The king of the pirates is violent, but more importantly, he is deeply attached to the notion of kingship, and he has started to tell himself that everything that he does for the common good, when in reality, he and the pirates are the reason why the universe that the uncle created is being destroyed. So, in that regard, they're like a force of nature villain, because they have no intellect to speak of. But if you compare them with other force of nature villains from other Ghibli movies, you perfectly realize that they're completely failed. Look at, for example, the Homu from Nausicaa. The Homu are actual giant insects. They can't even talk. And yet, their culture and their goal in life is so much more defined than the parrots in The Boy and the Heron, which is a shame because, again, the parrots are supposed to be the big villain of the movie. They're supposed to replace the gray heron once the gray heron becomes just a plot device. The thing is that the parrots are also just a plot device, and the king is also just a plot device, outside, again, of all of this philosophy I'm sharing with you. So once the uncle realized that he fucked up when he created the parrots in the universe, he tries to pass the torch to Mahito because he believes that since Mahito is young and innocent, he is going to be able to fix his mistakes and he is going to be able to create a perfect universe. But you notice in the movie that Mahito refuses to even touch them because he understands that since he is human too, if he does touch them, he is going to corrupt them immediately. And the message in this is extremely simple. Humanity cannot interact with nature without corrupting it, because our endless thirst for power and control always leads to devastation and ruin. So, the attempt of the uncle of running away from the cruelty of his wood by creating an alternative one was completely misguided in the first place because in his attempt, the only thing he did is, just like with the parrots, create a copy of our universe that is just as cruel and just as bad. And since Mahito is aware that it is human nature and human malice that ruins the wood, he also gets that he can never become a creator. And there's this entire story too with his scar on his forehead, the relationship with Natsuko where he was forced to confront the fact that he has darkness in him, which makes him more mature than his uncle. There's also a lesson in this, the fact that with old age doesn't necessarily come wisdom. The experience that you have in life and your interaction with the universe is what is going to allow you to make the right decision when the time comes. And so, with that knowledge in him, Mahito understands that what is left for him to do, what his fate is not to hide away in an alternate universe, but to return to his wood and to face the reality of existence head on. And that's another Nietzschean theme that is present in the movie, namely amor fati, which is the acceptance of one's fate regardless of how horrible it is. And Mahito is not the only person who embodies that theme. Himi, his mother, also does, because even though she knows she's going to die if she goes back to her wood, she does it regardless because it will mean that Mahito can be born. So she's willing to accept her own fate if it means living a fulfilling life. And I personally really resonate with that theme. Because as a kid, when I watched Spirited Away, for example, I couldn't understand why at the end Chihiro chooses to leave. When she has the choice to stay, why wouldn't you stay in this beautiful, phantasmagorical universe instead of returning to your boring existence where you have to go to school, you have to wash your teeth? All of that is so mundane. I didn't quite understand what story the entire plot was trying to share with me and what message it was trying to impress upon me. And that message is what you see in The Boy and the Heron. It's ridiculous to try and run away from life by hiding in artificial paradises because the only thing you're really doing is you're not actually living. And that level of escapism that tends to verse into nihilism is the surest way to live an unfulfilling existence and to end up extremely miserable. And this is also what Mahito realizes. He realizes that by clinging onto his dead mom and by chasing phantoms, essentially, he wasn't actually living. He was a living dead. So, as an effort to regain control over his fate, He had to accept the fact that Natsuko was his new mom and that it was stupid to try and live in the past because the past was already gone. Which is why, as I said previously, the original name of the movie was How Do You Live? It's a question to the hero, and it's a question also to the audience. How do you live? Are you living with the past? Are you living with ghosts? Or are you living in the present? Are you accepting your fate and are you trying to do the best with what you have? The problem is that all of these great messages I just shared with you are crammed in the last 20 minutes of the movie. So just like with the character development at the start, you have no time to take it in. And as a result, it feels more like a philosophy speedrun where you're supposed to get things super fast than an actual story. To the point that I'm fairly certain that the majority of people who watched this movie didn't understand any of that. My poor mom called me to tell me that she didn't get the movie. She was utterly confused, and it's heartbreaking because she's a Miyazaki fan. So the fact that the core audience of these movies are left feeling unsatisfied at the end of what should have been a culmination of his work is really saying something. And you know, I get it. It was supposed to be a celebration. But what is the point if you just end up with poorly fleshed out characters, a string of Easter eggs that have no real coherent narrative arcs or themes that connect them to one another? I mean, okay, great, sure, I enjoyed seeing the Wara Wara, I enjoyed seeing the parrots, all of these little references to past movies, that's cool. But if it's the entire movie, if it's the only thing the movie has to offer, then it's not a movie. I can just go back and rewatch the previous ones, because at least the old movies aren't full of plot holes and their philosophy and message is clearly defined. And this is what ultimately frustrates me with The Boy and the Heron. If it just had turned out to be a bad movie, I wouldn't care. But it's actually a good movie. It's a movie with a shit ton of potential to be a masterpiece. But because it tries to be multiple masterpieces at once, it just ends up as a big, disappointing what if. And maybe that's the point. Maybe I didn't understand the message of the movie. Maybe the movie is really just an expression of Miyazaki's anxiety, which is a theory that my wife came up with, and she told me I had to give her credit. But all jokes aside, it's actually a great theory. It's the idea that the uncle is not just a stand-in for Nietzsche, it's also a stand-in for the author. An author who has many stories to tell, many universes to create, but not enough time. Miyazaki is old. He's not going to live forever. And the issue is that he has no one to replace him. So seen through that lens, The Boy and the Heron is actually the story of a man who got too ambitious with his creations and who is desperately trying to find a successor to take his place and to take over because he's afraid that all of his art and all of these creations are just going to end up disappearing when he dies. Plus, it'd be quite ironic if Miyazaki was self-aware, if he realized that the movie has too much in it, but as a creator, he just couldn't help himself. He just had to add more and more and more, just like the uncle had to add more and more and more until the point where the entire thing crumbled upon itself. But that's just one interpretation. You could also just regard this movie as art for art. So trying to find a meaning behind the visuals is entirely pointless. What matters is the pursuit of aesthetic excellence without any substance. I would be very surprised because it's not Miyazaki's style, but that could be an explanation. It could also be just a big middle finger from Miyazaki to the animation industry, which is notorious for being cash-driven and just cranking out garbage productions for the sake of making as much money as possible, which is something that Miyazaki is entirely opposed to, despite the fame that he accumulated by making these movies and the fact that Studio Ghibli is massive. Every single creation of theirs is a treasure and it feels authentic. And please don't get me wrong, this movie also does. This movie is still better than 99% of the Japanese animation out there. It's just that when it comes to Ghibli standards, it's not up to par. And lastly, the final interpretation I have for you guys, this movie could be a warning about what AI is going to turn art into. Meaning a succession of beautiful, but ultimately entirely soulless visuals Because yes, the machines are technically perfect, but when it comes to inspiration, when it comes to creating things that can move humans emotionally, they will forever be outmatched by a human with a pen and a piece of paper. I will conclude this essay by saying that to me, this movie feels selfish. Unlike other Ghibli movies that were clearly created for the audience to make the audience feel something, this to me was created for the sake of the author. And maybe that's the real message of The Boy and the Heron, that all creation are ultimately selfish. Regardless, these are the reasons why I believe that The Boy and the Heron is a disappointing mess, and why it will likely not have the same cultural impact that other Ghibli movies enjoyed. I don't think I'll ever rewatch this movie, and I rewatch Mononoke and Spirited Away every single year, because every time I rewatch these movies, I learn something new about myself. I don't think the same can be said for that Ghibli movie. And that concludes this video. If you're still there, wow, you are a Ghibli nerd. Congratulations. I'm very interested in your thoughts. I would really love to hear what you have to say. If you watched the movie, if you hated it, if you loved it, if you think I'm a fucking idiot, please let me know. I will read every single comment and respond to every single one if I can. If you enjoyed this long segment, you can support the channel on my Ko-fi page. It's the first link in the description. This channel is now my second job, and to be able to keep up with the production, I have to rely on donations and memberships. So if you feel like supporting my work, that would be very helpful. As I said, I love Ghibli movies, and I have many ideas for other videos where I would analyze some of my favorites. So let me know. It will depend entirely on the way the audience receives this video. But that is going to be that for tonight. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you very soon.